I started this job by removing the vanity cover, the air filters and the intake manifold. There's plenty of videos online about how to do those parts of the job. It's consistent with the 135 and 335 that also have the N54 engine, so you shouldn't have trouble finding videos for how to do those parts of the job. And there are some good videos online already about how to install the port injection plate on an N54 engine. It's not unique to the Z4, so I'll post a link in the description to at least one of those videos. In summary though, I've got the manifold off here and I removed the stock shorter manifold studs and installed the longer manifold studs that come in the Black Market Parts port injection kit. I'd already done a walnut blast on my engine only a few thousand kilometres earlier, and there was already some build-up, but I think that's an acceptable level to continue with the job. But if you have a significant carbon build-up in the intakes and on the valve stems, then you'll want to do a walnut blast before continuing this job, or find another way to clean the gunk out. I installed the feed line with the T-piece on the other end to the port injection plate, and then put the plate into the car using new O-ring seals, the oval shaped seals between the port injection plate and the head. And then I've twisted the pre-installed injectors around a little bit just so the connectors are facing out, ready to connect up. Then I've connected up the Reflex Plus injector loom. The longest wire, or the longest part of the lead, runs to cylinder 1, and the lead feeds back towards cylinder 6, towards the firewall, the shortest one. And then connected up the feed line for the port injection rail, the fuel line, and that tees in to the high pressure fuel pump feed line just there under the starter motor. Then I went ahead and reinstalled the intake manifold and all of the parts associated with that, along with the air cleaner, and I used new oval shaped O-rings between the intake manifold and the port injection plate. And now I'll move on to the Z4 specific instructions on how to install the Reflex Plus port injection kit. I removed the cover for the DME enclosure. It's a series of Torx screws around the edge of it, and here I am about to talk about how I made a hole in the DME enclosure to bring the port injection cable through. Here's how I got the hole started. Just to reduce the angle of attack of the drill, I just used a 1/4 inch drive extension, the straightest one I had. A 1/4 inch drive socket on the 1/4 inch drive extension into the stepped drill. And I've got this stepped drill bit on a ratchet in here, so I can get a nice square hole. And I've just finished drilling it out to 16mm for the gland nut. So the hole is here in the DME enclosure, so there it is zoomed out. So the firewall here, so it's between these two connectors here, halfway in between, left to right. I just guessed that by eye. And as far as the distance down from the top edge, it's 48mm down from the top edge to the center of that hole. So that's where you should mark, 48mm down, halfway in between. So it's 48 measured from this top edge, and that will give you a little bit of clearance still under this little tab sticking out here to be able to tighten up the gland nut. And that's the cable gland that I'm using. So it's to suit a 5 to 10mm cable through here. The cable that passes through is 10mm or 9 point something millimeters at its biggest, and generally it's about 8mm. The cable runs out to the injectors. It's a 16mm, so that's the size of the hole that you have to drill for this cable gland. Now I've already started pulling out the pins from the plug. I just used that flat blade screwdriver there to poke that from this side. Just push up with a flat blade screwdriver, and that easily clipped up, so those ears are just sitting 1mm or 2 proud, and then you can start to pull the wires out. Now these wires aren't labelled, so if you pull them all out and can't remember how they go back together, you might be in trouble. You might be firing off the wrong injectors. I'm not going to be pulling out any of these fancy coloured wires on this part of the loom that I'm holding. It's just the red and black wires that go out to the injectors, so that I can pass this cable through the cable gland. So with the pin thing removed there, what I've done to mark the cables is, you can see a red mark there. I've used a red paint pen on the black wire to just draw a diagonal line across all the wires when they're in place. Rather than try and number them, there's not much room to number them, just a diagonal line. So when I put them all back in, I should still see that red diagonal line on the black wires. And I've noted that it's diagonal down to this corner. On the other side of the red wires, I've used a black marker, and I've taken a photo of that. Black marker sort of squiggled around a bit, didn't draw exactly straight, but you get the idea. So I can pull all those wires out now, pass them through the cable gland, and then screw the cable gland through that hole there. I'm about halfway there. You see most of them, the metal connector is showing, so I'm just easing out each wire at a time, both the red and the black wires. Still not pulling on the whole cable yet. That'll become obvious once when we can do that. At the moment I must be getting very close. Still not pulling on the whole cable at once. Now I'm just basically got to this point and I'm just pulling out each individual wire, working my way through them. And there you go, that's separated from the plug. Now at this stage, something I should have done earlier before I even installed this was run some conduit around this cable. It's optional. Look, each electrical wire in here has its own sheath on it, and then there's this other sheath around it. But I want to put it up against the firewall here and try and match the look of this conduit for the best sort of OEM look. So I've reached down as far as I can down in there near the injector of cylinder 6 and started the conduit. Got it started to about this point. Because the plugs off the end here can slide a 10mm spanner over, and this is just 10mm conduit, 10mm internal diameter. And now at this point, I'll try and do it while I hold the camera, but basically you just pull the spanner along and it just popped out, and it feeds the cable into the conduit, into that split tubing. And I'll run the split tubing up to somewhere around here where I'll cut it off, and then leaving enough room that I can trim it back as I need to, depending on the length to come through here to connect up to the reflex box. So there's the reflex module. It's actually already in the hole there. It's a perfect fit. Now it's going to be difficult to get it out, but that actually slides in. There was a vacant hole there, and that reflex module fits in perfectly there. It even gets its own little retaining clip to hold it in, and that's not going anywhere. The split tubing is on. Where are we now? I can't tell which one's which. That's the one I've done. Split tubing's on, and I've routed it the way I want it to go. So it goes over the top of this air inlet, but underneath the these catch can lines on the high side of the catch can, goes underneath them, across to here behind this junction box for the battery connection, and then go along under there. And what I've done is I've terminated the split tubing about 14 centimeters from the end. Disassemble the cable gland. So there's the nut that slides on first, so slide that on, then take the rubber seal out of the cable gland, slide that on next, then the cable gland itself, and now this can be all put back together. Feed the rubber seal into the cable gland there underneath these little flutes here, and then that can be roughly just tightened back up loosely, and then we can take this nut off this side and pass this through the hole in the DME enclosure. To make it easier to reassemble the wires into the plug, I wanted a bit more length on it, so I wasn't trying to fiddle with the wires all down in that little spot there. So I've just pulled the split tubing back up the cable a little bit, moved the cable gland up, and I'll pass this through. Now do not forget to remove this nut, because if we put the plug back together and you forget that, taking that off, then you'll have to pull it all apart again, start again. So put that there in a safe place, and we're left with the seal, the rubber seal on here, and that will stay on the outside of the enclosure. So now these will feed through the hole there, and then I'll start to reassemble the plug. And take the nut for the inside before we put the plug on, slide that over, and now the connectors can go back into the plug, making sure they go back in the right ports in the same order. I've carefully got them all started, so all 6 black wires and 6 red wires are started. They finish in the right spots on this corner with my line angling down towards that corner for both the black wires and the red wires for the black line. And now I'll just keep slowly feeding them all in a little bit at a time. Now, this should be a very slow and gentle process, but all the wires now, I've fed them all in. I did use these pointy nose pliers and angle on it, and these don't have, I'll try and focus on it, real deep indents or grip on them, so it's not likely to cut the sheath of the wire. It just helps you hold them and carefully feed each wire in, just a millimetre or 2 at a time, working your way around all 12 until they're all in. How do you know they're all in? You can see the metal part, the bright metal part of the connector through the hole on this side. So they're all back in. Last step is to push down, and I'm going to need to put the camera down, is to push these clips down, and both at the same time, and that will lock the pins into position. Also just check all your other pins and make sure nothing else is pulled out. You should be able to see the steel part of the pin there, the bright steel part of all the pins that are pinned in there, visible on this side before you slide those white tabs down to lock it all in position. And the retaining clip with these little white tabs is pushed back into position. As I said, make sure they're all the way through. I found one of these wires, the one just at the end of my fingernail there, just kept sliding back ever so slightly as I'd push down on this clip, and it wouldn't go down. So I held all the wires carefully, pushed them all hard up against the end there, and this clip went down really easily. It doesn't take any force whatsoever if all the pins are in. If you force it, you'll damage the pins, and then you'll be in a whole world of trouble. So that's back on there now. I can check that my wire there with my little red marks on the black wires all angle down together, and similarly on this side they've probably come off the black marks a bit, but you can see the black marks there angling down as well. What's left of the black marks on those red cables there. So that plug is now in position. Slide it, I'll plug it into the reflex box, pull it back out this side, slide the gland nut down, screw it on, put the split tubing back in place, and that should be complete. And now I'm ready to plug it all together, just to show once again how it'll fit. So this slides into there's a vacant space there, parking spot right there for it. So I'll just slide that through there, push it in, and locks into place. That's now in position, and connect it up. Tighten up this nut here on this side nice and tight. That seals the cable gland against the box, and then the nut on the outside here is what seals the cable gland against the cable. Now there is extra room in here that if you do need to run extra wires out for ethanol sensor or other sensors, you can squeeze them down the side of this wire once you've tightened that up. But before you tighten up this nut on the outside, push whatever wires you want through. Individual wires fit through. I've just got 2 there through of this loom just for demonstration purposes. I think I could easily put another 2, 3, 4 wires through and then tighten that cable gland up. I needed to trim another 15 mil or so, 20 mil. So it is probably best to go just 16 centimeters, 16.5 centimeters of loose end on there, and that's meant that this has still got a little bit of free play in it. It's not pulled completely tight. The other connector, just pushed it down in under there. That's got all those other connectors on it. I'm now going to start connecting some of those up with the other wires in the DME box. But yeah, that's yeah, how to route it. So those wires, if they were for the ethanol sensor, could go inside of conduit or whatever else and run down to wherever they need to go. This cable here now, I'll cut these cable ties on the firewall and feed new ones through and bundle it in there, and it will look nice and neat and tidy. Any loose end that I've got is going to be pushed right down to right down in here, so that as the motor tilts under torque inside the engine bay, that cable doesn't get pulled tight. So there's the cable there. There's still a little bit of quite a little bit of play in it there. So that's worked out quite good. The cable is just long enough, really. Yeah, if it was 5 or 10 centimeters shorter, this option wouldn't work for us with the Z4. Now, before working on the DME, disconnect the negative battery terminal there, so that's out of the way. Now, don't allow your, just use a 10mm spanner, don't allow your trunk or boot lid to close, because it requires electricity to open again. So put a towel or something over there. I've got one on each side here, and then if I do, this does come down, the trunk isn't going to lock shut. Now the DME is that silver box under there towards the back. So there's the firewall. Our reflex unit is behind it there, but that's the DME. There's four connectors, but they're sort of paired together too. So 2 smaller connectors on this end and 2 larger ones on that end. I've already pulled this out. So these tabs pull away. So that was originally pushed in against it there. You grab hold of that there, pull it out a little bit and get your finger in behind, and you'll wiggle that out, and that also lifts the plug up and helps disconnect it. To do the one on the other side, you pull it away, but it runs into the side of the enclosure there before it releases, so you can't get it all the way out. What you have to do is disconnect this main power wire, just push that out of the way for a minute, and now you can lift the, for me, the DME I think can come out of the box there. There's clips holding in, but in fact the whole yellow part of the enclosure comes up, lifted above this edge as you pull out on this, and this plug comes off as well. I've lifted that up. It's hard to do it with one hand with the camera, so I pulled that whole yellow enclosure thing up enough. That's slid out. You can see there's a ramp on the side of it, so that pulls the connector out. That's the larger of the pair of connectors, so it's actually well, here one actually physically does look like one, but on this side it's 2, I think, and they come out of there. We'll get to that in a minute. Just pay attention to the routing of all the cables as you undo things. So that cable's routed in behind there, this went on top, and we're now going to pull this connector off, and then I can see that's the shorter of the 2 connectors that are in there. So I've gone through and identified all the cables, but this plug down the front of the DME box down here, this green one, is the first plug we've got to find. That's this X60553, which in this diagram, you know, shows up here, which is for a 335 or 135 BMW. For the Z4, that is that plug there at the front of the box, and pin 2 on that is the wire towards the back there. So there's just 2 orange wires in there. as it turns out, I've used a multimeter and verified these are both positive 12 volts switched with ignition, so you could actually use either of them, but they're recommending that pin 2, so that's the one we'll use. If you're not sure, you can take that connector out, and the numbers on it are here: 8765, turn it over, 1 2 3 4. So putting a little cable tie on there and pop that one back in. The second connector that we need to find, not worried about this optional one here, and this main chassis ground is a wire we'll need to run to ground. Next one we need to find is this CAN bus high and low in plug X6001, pin 14 and pin 1. So that's actually, it's very hard, but it's actually the smaller of the two plugs. See if I can find a way to twist this around. Just back around. So with it twisted that way, and get my orientation, yeah, it's this plug. It's this plug here at the bottom. So you can actually see a number there, 1 and 14. So it's the 2 pins there. So you can check that and verify it, and you'll find that it's this cable here that pulls out from underneath. And because it's CAN, they're always twisted. So it's actually this twisted pair here. So there it is there, and the wiring thing tells us we're looking for a blue wire with a red stripe and a red wire, and that's what we find there going to those. So you can track those back to that pin. There's a cover over the top here that makes it hard to see where those pins go in. You can slide this out just by clipping that little plastic clip in the center of my fingernail there. Pull that back with a little screwdriver, and you can actually slide that grey plug out a bit if you want to verify that's where the blue and red wires go. But on my car, it's that grey plug there, X6001 is that plug, and it's pins 1 and 14. And I've put a cable tie on there, and I plan to do this with all the wires. I've done this with all the wires because I don't want to put the taps on until I've put all the wiring back in and see where the most ideal place is to put the tap on. So that's the first one. Oh, that's the next one there, X6001. Intake cam sensor signal is plug X6007, pin 11. So from memory, that's on this bigger one here, and if we look, yeah, X6007 is this one down the bottom here, and it's pin 11. So try and zoom in there. You can see 13 and 26 up this end, 13 counting backwards, 12, 11. So it's the third pin on that way. Turn it over, and there it is there. Trying to get my fingernail on it, that yellow wire coming out of the third pin there, and I've put a cable tie on it further up there. That's that next one. So once again, the yellow that matches. In fact, all the colors here match what we have in the Z4, so they're identical to the 135 and 335. The last ones here we need to find are pin 10 and 29 on X6005. So that's also here, except that's the long one up the top here, X6005, and we need pin 10, so we can see a 1 on this end and a 22 on that end, and then a 23 up here and a 44. So 10 is going to be 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10, so 10 pins in along the bottom row, and 29 is 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, about 6 pins in on the top. So if I flick that over, we needed 10 pins in along the bottom. So remembering that's the bottom, oops, that's the bottom there, it's hard to hold it, but where the 1 is, where my thumb is. So we'll flip that over. We're looking for the 10th wire along there. Now this is very hard to show with one hand while trying to film, and as I said, you'll see I've got extra wires in here that aren't normally in a Z4, so I've added 3 extra wires, and there's 2 of them that are in that top row. They're actually for a low pressure fuel sensor that I've added from a 135 or 335 that isn't fitted normally to a Z4. Basically count 10 holes along the top there until you find the yellow wire in there, cable tie on it, and similarly the bottom one here, there's a blue and white, that's pin 23, so turning it over, that's 23 is that blue and white wire, and hard to see, but you can count the slots there, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, so then it's the next yellow wire, there it is there. That's the yellow wire, so I've marked them with the respective cable ties. They're both yellow wires and they've both got cable ties on them, so when I put the taps on, I need to identify which one is 10 and which one's 29, but I'll just roughly follow them back down to see which side of the plug they go onto. And that's all of the connections except for this main chassis ground, which is a wire we need to add, and I'll need to run it out probably through the hole here, and there's actually a chassis ground point right outside there, which is handy, so we'll ground it onto that one there, and that will just run a little black wire in for this pin 3 main chassis ground. Actually, sorry, the wire will already be on the loom. I think we've just got to pass it out and put an eyelet on it and put it over that screw. Now I'll put the plugs back on the DME, so the small one's on, just putting the large one on, holding this whole thing up, put it in place, slide that back in, and that pulls it down. Now that can drop back down inside the box there. And I disconnected this main power wire here, so we'll route that. It was actually originally over the top. I'll probably route it underneath, and that'll give me access to all the points where I need to put these taps. And here's the loom from the reflex side, so that plugs in there to that multi-pin Deutsch plug. It's the only one it fits into. All the others I think are 2 and 3 pin Deutsch plugs, so that'll go in there. And this has got the wires that we need to tap into those DME wires. Now this loom is, let's try and zoom out here, is miles too long. There are labels on the ends of these, cam, crank, etc. I'll trace them back to the pins on the plug, because that's what the diagram gives us, is the colours. There's 4 black wires there. I'll trace those wires back to the plug to verify it, but otherwise I'm going to leave this as long as it is. I'll just curl it up nice and tight, and then the whole lot, there's plenty of space actually down here behind the reflex box there, where it can sit in that DME enclosure. Otherwise, if you wanted to, you could significantly shorten these cables. These are the connectors that come with the reflex kit, so aligned with where they need to go. So this pin 1 main switch wire is going to use this and this connector. So it's a crimp fitting to go around the wire, and a little terminal connector to pop in there. Pin 2 is that optional one. We're not worried about installing that. Pin 3 is this main chassis ground, so it comes with an eyelet, as I suspected, so that'll go on that black wire after we've passed the black wire through. And then pins 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8, all of these wires all use these wire taps. So they're the connectors that come with it. This is the first connector for the power wire. The orange wire of the green connector, and this is using like a Scotch lock. So place the wire in that position, fold that over, get a pair of pliers and crimp it shut, and what happens is it pushes the wire down into that little slot there. I'll try and focus on it. That little slot there, and that cuts the sheath of the wire. Now technically I don't think this is the right size for this gauge wire. I'll use it anyway, but I think that's for a smaller gauge wire, judging by the gap in there. But that's how that gets installed, and then we put the other crimp terminal, bullet terminal on the wire, and put it down through the top of the connector afterwards. That's crimped in place. I'd never put one of these connectors hard up against the green connector, because if you damage the wire or need to repair the wire, you've got nothing maybe left to grab hold of and strip the wire back and solder onto. So I've placed it about an inch and a half up from the green connector. Crimp that, or tighten that with a pair of pliers, and then stripped a bit of the red wire off. So this is the only red wire in the loom, and tracked it back through that fuse through to pin number 1 there. Take a bit of wire off take some sheath off the wire, expose the wire, put the little bullet connector on, crimp that on, and then that goes in to the hole here and pushed into place. Once again, a bit hard one-handed. Goes in there, and that's the power connection up to pin. So pin 2 doesn't matter, the orange, the optional wire, nothing needs to happen there. Pin 3 of the reflex plug, a black wire, goes to main chassis ground. So tracked pin 3 here out to this black wire. The other ones are labelled anyway with crank and cam and intake. Crank, cam and map. So this one just doesn't have a label on it. So I've passed it out through the plug there, then I've bared the wire, crimped the connector on, taken this nut off, and this is going to be the ground. So we'll put that nut back on, tighten it up, and carefully run the cable back down, tighten up the cable gland here, and pull that back through, and that'll be that ground wire done. And I've put the first 2 posi taps on, or T-taps. That's onto the CAN wires. So there is a twist in CAN wires for a reason, so don't untwist them, just untwist it enough to get those on. In this case, the blue and red wire was going to the yellow, and the red wire on that CAN circuit was to the green here. So those posi taps are on. I'm now going ahead and just putting the posi taps into all the other wires that I've got my cable tie on in a position that is is accessible. So the way these work is this plug comes apart like that. This bit slides over the wire. Now let's zoom out a little bit, this is the wire that'll be going onto, so we'll just try and do this one-handed. So that'll go like so, and then this bit, which has a sharp little pin on it, screws down into there, pierces the sheath and makes contact with that pin, and then we unscrew the top part here, bare some wires, and put that in. We'll get to that in a second, but that'll now, try that wire out of the way, that'll now screw onto there, and it'll crimp that or cut that wire, or pierce that wire and make the connection. I'll go ahead and do that for all of the wires we've got to connect up. Here's the last one, the map sensor wire. So carefully remove that, bared about, try and hold that steady, about 4 or 5 millimeters of cable, twisted it, place that over. Try and do this one-handed, and then that will go into there, and push it in, hold it in while you tighten that up, and it will hold the wire in place and hold it connected to that terminal. Now, just to make sure these posi taps are working properly, I'm using a multimeter on a continuity test to check for continuity between the pin on this connector and the pin on the DME connector. So I'm not going to be able to show you this one-handed, but I've pulled the plugs back out, put one part of the multimeter in the relevant pin there. Just use a paper clip or a little metal object just to slide into where the pin is, because these are a bit too big to fit into the connectors. And then the same on this side. Oh, actually this one fits all right, just goes into the ends there and can make contact. So checking basically for continuity between now this plug and that plug through that posi tap to make sure they're all fine, and they are in my case. So now I can put it all back together and tidy up the wiring. Put that connector back in, and just to point out, this orange wire we're not using, that was that optional 5-volt wire, so it's not being used. and I'll just use the cable ties that come with this to coil up all this cabling and tuck it into the DME enclosure down behind where I put the reflex box. That's all the wiring complete. Make sure your cable gland back there is done up nice and tight. Just put some cable ties around that. All my posi tap things are sitting on top there, which I think is probably the best place for them. Not stressed pulling on a wire down low here. They're also more easily accessible. Plug this that one there, connector back in the main power line. That was running across the top of everything, now it runs sort of underneath it. Everything's back in there nice and neat, and now the lid will go back on. And now that all that wiring is complete, the negative terminal can go back on the battery. And covers back on. Final bit of housekeeping, some new cable ties here to hold all the cabling together. The excess slack in this Motiv Reflex cable is all down here near the port injection plate, so that allow for that little bit of rocking motion left and right, the torque twist in the engine, but also if ever do the engine mounts or anything again, there's a bit of slack there that's not going to pull that cable tight and pull it out of the injectors. Here's a little update since I've had it all installed and driving the car around, doing my first upgrades now and modifying the installation that I originally did. So originally drilled a hole in here, 16mm hole for this cable gland, and that was adequate if you, or for me, it was just doing port injection and the earth lead, and I added an ethanol sensor, and all that wiring just squeezed through that cable gland. However, I ended up needing to add a Reflex Plus low pressure fuel sensor, and now I've also added the Nexus oil pressure sensor here. So that's the oil pressure switch, original one, just unscrewed, and the loom there. I've now got to run this cable to this new Nexus oil pressure sensor back to the DME. That will wire into the DME and give me an oil pressure reading, and I think we can set up some safeties on it that if the oil pressure drops, I can cut the fuel injection or the ignition to help save the motor. So the cable gland needs to be upgraded to a bigger size. So this is the one I need to install. It's a 20mm hole for this one. Luckily, when I drilled the original hole, I put it in a position that now, changing to a bigger hole, I'm not interfering with any of these little plastic tabs and stuff on the back. So there's still enough room around them to put this in and tighten up the nut on the cable gland. So keep that in mind and maybe consider just going straight to this larger one, especially if you've got more wires to run in there. Let's talk about the low pressure fuel sensor. Because on my car, this is a Z4, which doesn't come with a low pressure fuel sensor. But prior to this, I'd spent a lot of time installing one. So I'm going to try and zoom in there. Let's try and get it on in frame. It's in the center of frame there, just behind the back of the high pressure fuel pump. There we go, focused on it. It's got a little yellow dot on it, little corrugated black cable line going to it. So this car doesn't come with a low pressure fuel sensor. I've added that in there. I bought it from a 335 along with the engine loom and modified my engine loom, running wires up through these lines, spending hours on it to get a low pressure fuel sensor wired into my DME. The tuner that I'm using, Wedge Performance, has managed to allow me to monitor the low pressure fuel sensor, or that sensor, by changing some of the coding in my tune. So I'm able to monitor it, which is great. I'm not doing closed loop control of the low pressure fuel pump like the 335 does. I'm still using the Z4 open loop control, which just runs a map, but at least I was able to monitor the low pressure fuel reading. Now, The Reflex Plus has the option of a low pressure fuel sensor, and in hindsight I didn't need to bother with all of that stuff I did down there with the genuine stuff. I could have just left it, and being a Z4 I did want that low pressure fuel sensor, but I could have just upgraded, or sorry, just added the Reflex Plus like I'm doing now anyway. And the reason that you want the Reflex Plus over the stock one is that the Reflex Plus low pressure fuel sensor allows you to monitor it on MHD, so you can still see the reading of what's there, but it also allows the tuner to build some safety into the system. So if the low pressure fuel reading gets too low, if the pressure drops too low, then the Reflex Plus can be programmed to reduce the duty cycle on the port injectors so that there's still enough fuel to supply the high pressure system, the direct injection, and not starve the engine. So it's an important safety measure that you definitely want to consider getting that low pressure fuel sensor on the Reflex Plus, especially if you have a Z4. That way you can at least monitor it, and that makes it very good for diagnosis. If you have fuel issues, you can check whether it's your low pressure fuel pump or something in that line that might be failing. So with those extra wires, larger cable gland is necessary. Now that everything is installed and working properly, at least for the moment, let me go over the issues that I've had along this journey. Now they mostly relate to the Motiv Reflex side of things. So the first problem is the wiring diagrams, at least what's published at the moment from Motiv. The wiring diagram, the colours in the wiring diagrams don't match the looms that they're shipping. So for example, this connector here is a orange, a black and a dark green wire. That doesn't exist on their wiring diagram. So unfortunately, when you're connecting things up, you have to trace, it's really just the auxiliary sensors and things, you have to trace it from the pin. So you have to look at the diagram, check the pin number on the Reflex Plus, and then check what colour's coming out, and then trace that up to the relevant plug to know where to connect things into. And that applied to the ethanol content sensor and this plug here, which is for the auxiliary fuel pressure sensor that I've got wired in. So that was the first trouble, one of the first issues that I came across. Second issue relates to these CAN connectors. Now I used a multimeter, these CAN bus connectors. I used a multimeter to verify that I had connectivity before I started the car and everything else. But of course you push down on this wiring to put the lid back on, and what happened is the connectivity broke between these CAN wires and the car's twisted pair of CAN wires, and the car went haywire. Windscreen wipers were on flat out and I couldn't turn them off. Fault codes galore flashing up, and very unnerving thing to happen. And luckily it happened, while the car wasn't running, but I couldn't imagine, what it'd be like if you're, 100 mile an hour, 6,000 RPM, 20 PSI boost, and you lose connectivity of these wires. It'd be a scary thing to happen, but it may also be catastrophic for your engine. So before too long, I am going to swap this out with a different way of connecting those wires up that gives me a more solid connection. I just haven't found it yet. If anything, it might just be bearing back the wires, soldering them, and running some heat shrink up and over them, depinning it from the DME, taking my time and doing it properly. So that was another issue that I had at the start. Furthermore, when I went to connect up this this fuel pressure sensor, which plugs in here, I had a lot of trouble. I couldn't get it to work. I spent an hour, checking all my wiring and making sure I was in the right connector, because of course their wiring diagram's wrong. But as it turns out, the wires in the plug that they shipped were around the wrong way. So the red and the black wires here were swapped around, or from the factory, and I needed to swap them back. So I had to disassemble this connector and move them. And that was only, the wiring diagram for this specifically states that if you mess up the wiring, you void your warranty. But ironically, they're shipping it with the wiring in the wrong position. And it was only my tuner that mentioned to me that he also got one from them that was wired wrong and suggested just try swapping the wires around. I did, and it worked. So that was another issue. So when it comes to wiring, yeah, a lot of troubles there. Another issue is the ethanol content sensor. So this was a brand new ethanol content sensor. The sensor itself is perfectly fine. It's within specification, but Motiv haven't allowed for the potential error that can exist in these. So even they told me that these sensors are plus or minus 5% or 5 hertz on the readings. So the readings can be out by about 5%. So let's say E0 can actually measure as potentially as E minus 5, so minus 5% ethanol, which is sort of impossible, but it can read that, or 5% ethanol when you have 0 ethanol in there. And this sensor reads a little bit low, 1 or 2% low, but because of that, it was tripping fault codes through the Reflex Plus to the MHD to the DME. I'd get a MHD 005 fault code, which is ironically a fault code for water in the fuel. So it actually turns out that MHD almost, I think, know about the error that Reflex have made and are trying to undo it in their side of the system. But nonetheless, brand new sensor within spec from Continental, but it doesn't work with this system. So I had to bite the bullet and buy a new one because of that. So the next thing that I'll talk about is the cable. So there's it doesn't come with one. You have to provide your own programming cable for the Reflex Plus. So it's a micro USB cable that you need to do the job. And I plugged my first cable in and no connectivity, and tried another cable, no connectivity, tried a third cable, no connectivity, tried a different laptop, still no connectivity. At that point, I figured I had a faulty Reflex Plus module. I thought I'll just try one more cable. So I got this GoPro cable. It's actually branded GoPro. It came with a GoPro camera. As it turns out, this works. So they're very fussy with the cable that you use. So there's obviously differences in micro USB cables. So be aware of that. If it's not connecting, you may need to find yourself another cable. Thanks for watching. That's all I've got to say.